Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. We are now just a little outside of a year away from the 2024 election. So we're kicking off this week with an episode focused on one of the biggest themes that will define the coming months. Donald Trump in 2020 won 12 million more votes than he did in 2016. Obviously, that wasn't enough to surmount the lead of Joe Biden, but it did hint at the future of the GOP's coalition. Donald Trump managed to vastly increase his support in the working class, not merely in the white working class, but also in the multiracial working class as well. So my guest today, Republican pollster Patrick Ruffini, he's on to discuss whether this trend is going to play out in 2024 and what it means for the future of the GOP's coalition. Hope you all enjoy this conversation. Patrick Ruffini, welcome to the Realignment.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Your book is super helpful because it gets to the core of a big debate that obviously is encapsulated all these various realignment spaces. So I'll just ask you the question very directly. To what degree is the idea that the Republican Party is becoming more populist, becoming more working class oriented, and more broad when it comes to minorities in the coalition, to what degree is that real versus like a marketing pitch that Ted Cruz could basically use and say, while pursuing the same policies Ted Cruz has always perceived?
I think it's real from the voting base of the Republican Party. I really try to take a voter-centric view of this question, right, in terms of who is voting for the party. And if you just look at it from that perspective, it's been a pretty dramatic shift from, at least when I first started in politics, or I first became politically aware, let's say in the 1990s. In the 1990s, you had this massive gap between how people voted based on income. So you had people at the top who voted about 40 to 45 points more Republican, and people in the sort of top part of the income distribution more did 40 to 45 points more Republican on net than the people at the bottom end. Today, that gap has shrunk to 8 points. Now, that hasn't reversed because you still have quite a bit of non-white working class, you still have quite a few non-white working class voters, right? And they are still a Democratic group, just less Democratic. But the Democrats' traditional advantage as being the party of the working class, as being the so-called party of the people, has eroded. They really seem to have lost a good bit of that identity, as many of those voters have now shifted towards the Republican Party. Now, I think that might be a different question, though, than the party's policies, which I would argue no, haven't shifted very much at all, right? I mean, I think that there's been certainly a change in emphasis in the issue sets that both parties are. They have adapted to some degree, but not nearly to the extent you might expect that they would, based on the sea change in voting patterns. And I think that's an interesting question. Why?
And this is why it's cool to speak to a professional pollster, because you actually got to the key thing I was trying to make, which is there's a difference between the voting base and the actual platform. I mean, not existent in the case of the GOP, but the actual broad set of here are the sets of policies it means to be a Republican. So here's the question then. If the coalition is shifting in serious ways, yet we're not seeing the political framing, the policies, some of like the political totems that are used shift, that suggests there's a lag or a delay. It could be possible that a more working class and minority oriented Republican Party would hold a variety of different positions, but maybe will take till 2028, 2029, 2030. What do you think about the idea of there being a lag between voters and the actual policies or political stance?
I think there is a lag, but I also think that the relationship between what the policy should be and how people, maybe vote isn't as clear as you might imagine. So, you go back, and I start off the book by quoting Thomas Frank from What's the Matter with Kansas in 2004, and this was the classic paradox of why do all these working class voters vote against their economic self-interest when it's clear that the Democrats are the party of the working class, and why would why? And this was at the point when we're not even talking about working class voting for Republicans like it is today. So why has this flipped? And yet, really, there's only been really a subtle change in the policy platform, and that's because the policy. I think voters are not really have not been really that responsive to changes in economic policies. Most of this seems to have been as a result of changes in cultural emphasis. I think a lot of this ultimately comes down to the personality of Donald Trump and the style of candidate he was and the way he speaks, that I think it really resonated with working class voters, specifically across the racial divide, and at the same time repulsing college educated voters. So I do think you have definitely people on both sides of the class divide who are voting in ways that don't make sense if you just look at what the policy commitments of the parties are. But I also just simply think, based on the tendency that we've seen across Western nations, that this is not obviously an American phenomenon, as you know well, that the tendency has been, as societies get wealthier, that we become less concerned about voting for the party that specifically will protect these very hard-won economic gains. That we have the luxury now of voting our cultural beliefs. And I think that's what's happening across the board. And you're seeing, I think, a lot of this voting makes sense. It is rational from the perspective of if I'm voting on, who understands me, and not just as an economic being, but as somebody who has various cultural priorities and predilections as well.
I always, as someone who read What's the Matter of Kansas back in the 2000s, I've always kind of quibbled with the idea of voters just having any one set of interests that are supposed to top out. Because, yeah, you could have in 2003, right, when Thomas Frank is writing the book, a Republican voter in Kansas who likes card check or wants the minimum wage increase, but they could just be voting on the war on terror. And that's just the issue that they're going to prove their decision making on. So as a pollster, how should we think of the kind of shifting interests or different policy agenda issues that would matter more to a voter in a certain context or period?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have that famous scatter plot, that chart that Lee Drutman, a political scientist, made after the 2016 election. And you had on one axis was the economic axis, which is sort of left to right on the economy. Left to right, or left right on social issues was represented by the y-axis. It's easier for me to show a picture of it, but that was really it. And it was, you could, ask people a range of policy questions, and you plot people on that chart. And the really major takeaway from that was that there is a much bigger populist segment of the electorate, meaning economically left, socially right, than there is either a libertarian segment, which is sort of that get the government out of the boardroom and the bedroom, the sort of the classic moderate Republican view. Then there are even maybe classically conservative voters. And, when you looked at, and he looked at specifically those Obama to Trump voters lived primarily in that upper left quadrant, that populist quadrant. What that has told me, and we've recreated that. We've pulled this several years now running. What we find is, in general, with these types of analysis, is that when you have cross-pressured voters, you have libertarians and you have populists, right? It's not immediately obvious which party they should side with based on how they view the issues. That it really is culture and social issues, at least in the current moment, that is really actually driving differences in voting behavior. So, people's voting is more aligned with how they view cultural issues, like abortion, LGBTQ rights, all of those, in immigration. Those are the issues that are, at least in the current era, decisive to deciding how people will vote. There's also just not a very clear relationship on how people vote on the economy. So I think people vote on the economy on the basis of maybe the performance of the incumbent party, more so than economic philosophy, right? Whether or not, a candidate is friendlier towards labor unions or whether they're friendlier towards business. It's not to say that the economy doesn't matter in voting. It matters a great deal. It kind of creates this across the board, rising tide lifts all boats and effect. But that really is based upon the performance of the incumbent party rather than voters aligning with a certain set of beliefs on the economy.
Can you explain a little more the dynamics around these voters focusing more on the sociocultural issues? Because I think the kind of cliched by this point thing that we have all heard in the business is basically, if we look at where those Bernie voters were, if you look at where those Obama Trump voters, they were in the parts of the country that were most left behind economically, the parts of the country that were deindustrialized. So how does that fit into the story that you're telling there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is, those are simultaneously the voters that had these beliefs. But if you look at why those places were deindustrialized and really I think there's really been a shift in who's the bad guy there, right? And I think that I write about Flint, Michigan in the book as a place that was really in the 1990s and the late 80s emblematic of a labor left critique of the Reagan Bush era and kind of a pro-business kind of tilt in politics. That you had Michael Moore sort of first
What's
comes
the
on
movie?
the
I was trying
scene
to.
with
He did a movie. What was the movie?
Roger and Me, right? Roger
Yeah.
and Me, right? Where he's trying to hunt down and chase down the CEO of one of these car companies to talk about what's happening in his hometown where people are losing their jobs. So it really was the left at that moment in time that was the hero, or was trying to position himself as the champion of people in places like Flint. Flint pops up again in the 2016 campaign as a place where you had the Flint water crisis, and Hillary Clinton really effectively creates a big moment for herself in a primary debate by really talking about Black voters in Flint and Black citizens in Flint who are drinking lead poisoned water. And Bernie Sanders really in that moment could not match that, right? In terms of it was a good moment for her. But you also had, during the 2016 campaign, one of Donald Trump's first campaign stops was in Flint. And there he is talking about globalization, jobs moving to Mexico, trade as the boogeyman. So I think that is really the first time a Republican has gone to a place like Flint and effectively flipped the script as to who's responsible for what's going on here. Is it the big corporations? Is it the capital? Is it basically like the capitalist system that is represented more so by the Republican Party, and in general, kind of also a Republican Party that is inattentive to places like Flint when it comes to the drinking water and allowing lax regulations and things like that? Is that what's at fault for what's happening in these communities, or is it the fact that these jobs have been moving overseas? And which side is really siding with maybe more global interests versus interests closer to home? And I think that is the aspect of Trumpism that has been, I think, the biggest shift from a policy perspective on the Republican side. That you don't see Republicans, really rank and file Republicans, changing their position on taxes, on spending, on regulation, on those types of issues, on generally being friendly to, let's say, small and medium-sized businesses, where you do see them really changing their attitudes. And I think it's an easier shift to make is on trade and globalization, on extending kind of this tough guy attitude that we have to countries around the world, oftentimes militarily, to the realm of economic competition. And I think that is really what Trump honed in on. And that was really the key to explaining the 2016 shift, at least in part.
So I guess the question then is, what did Trump then do over those next 4 years to, once again, obviously not win the presidency, but actually solidify and increase the gains marginally in some cases, but I think, enough in a narrative of that a book like this really makes sense.
Right.
What did he do over those next
Yeah.
4 years?
No, it's funny because I was first contemplating writing the book before the 2020 election, but in seeing some poll numbers that were showing that, oh, actually, Trump seemed to be doing somewhat better, marginally better among Black voters, Latino voters. And I kind of had speculated that, like, maybe this is what's next, right? You had the big white working class shift in 2016, and maybe you will have a shift in the Latino vote or something that follows up on it, because this is sort of a working class. I mean, there's sort of this working class populist realignment, and, could this be a multiracial coalition? So it was really in the summer of 2020 that I really kind of started thinking about that. But then the George Floyd thing happened, and I quickly shelved the idea, or I decided to put the idea on hold, because it seemed like Trump was, losing support, right? I mean, it seems like he could lose big. But even if he had a pretty diverse coalition, or even if he did make some inroads, if he lost by 8 or 10 points, it's not going to matter very much. It's sort of going to be a footnote. And lo and behold, Trump wins.
Because this is very important to note.
Right.
Even if Trump had done better in that case, the book here is not, look at Trump. The point you're making is about the broader party and its structure. So the data point that'd be relevant isn't just, did Trump, who for very obvious reasons would unshockingly appeal. That's just a point I want to make clear.
Yeah, right. So but it's also because I do believe it's not just Trump, right? But in terms of what he did programmatically to make that happen, right? Because it's interesting, because you would not think that, Trump goes in 2016 and goes in and insults Latinos, and either doesn't, depending on which view you have, which exit poll you read, either doesn't lose Latino support or maybe makes marginal gains. And then Trump goes and does what he does at Lafayette Square and with the BLM protests, and then gains Black voters in the November election. I mean, that is not, there must be like a really much deeper undercurrent of populist sentiment, or of a belief that, maybe Trump actually just did a better job than past Republicans, my sort of heroes growing up, did in appealing to those and talking to those specific communities in a way that is pretty much completely missed in the elite conversation, the elite media conversation, right? Specifically in the immediate aftermath of these events. But I think programmatically, returning to your point, what does he do? Well, I mean, in some sense, not a lot. He didn't do a lot, because, I mean, you have a corporate tax cut. I mean, you certainly have moves on trade. You have chest beating on immigration. I think he does things on immigration to actually calm the situation down, certainly, at least in relation to where we are now, right? But if you look at his signature achievement, is a tax cut that is weighted, again, to corporations and the wealthy, which is not the kind of populist economic policy. So why do I raise that? Is that a complicating factor here? And no, I think it just reinforces the point that so much of this is cultural, so much of this is personality driven, and so much of this is frankly global, in the sense of, I mean, I think we are seeing this working class realignment happen really throughout the world, throughout at least Western societies, and especially in the English speaking countries. And so, I think there was a fascinating study that the authors, I think it was The Bitter End, the book that the sort of John Sides and Lynn Vavreck, and the academic they have the sort of academic view, I think, of what happened each election cycle. And the thing that they did was this interesting survey experiment where you put, you just put policy items, agenda items together, and then you kind of decide, you look at what's predictive of how people vote. And when you put tax policy in the issue set, right, you're not asking explicitly about tax policy, but you're asking a candidate who agrees with these 6 policy positions. You can put tax reform, impeaching Trump, closing the border, that sort of thing. Those types of issues, the things that he did, right, on economic policy made absolutely no difference to how people voted one way or the other. It was all a border wall, and, kind of the meta issue of impeaching Trump. That was an issue that they tested in this, this nationscape survey that interviewed 500,000 people throughout the course of the 2020 election. So I think that just reinforces the broader point that policy being decoupled from electoral outcomes.
something I'd be curious about, especially given to your point, you say this explicitly at the start of the book, like your political philosophy, your policy position, like your place in the Republican coalition is pretty straightforwardly George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, like Reaganite. I'd love for you just to kind of get personal for a second and just talk about what it's been like to write this book given that context, right? Because I was still in college when the GOP autopsy famously came out in 2013.
Yeah.
And just the conventional wisdom takeaway, I'm sure you could correct me on the takeaway, is basically just that, hey, the country's changing. Republicans can't keep up. We need to make some tough choices on immigration policy and cultural policy in order to kind of win. And the kind of funny take is, having just interviewed John Judas and Roy Tejera right before this episode, their conclusion is kind of that the Democrats are now in the same position. 10 years later, Democrats are going to have to make some tough choices about social cultural policy because the country hasn't changed the way they thought it would. Talk me through just the shift over this 10-year period, because I think that's a really interesting timing thing.
I mean, I was certainly again, a George W. Bush Republican and worked for his campaign. And that was really where I got my start in politics. And remembering the autopsy remembering attending some of the meetings about the autopsy, and not the policy sections, but when it came out, I was among the people. I was like, oh, finally! So this is overdue. Cheered. There's probably some tweets from me about this that says something along the lines, finally, Republicans are getting serious about winning again. What's interesting about the autopsy period too was that not only was there a Republican establishment, right, that finally kind of used this never let a good crisis go to waste and had this moment of clarity to try to push through, or make their stand. Donald Trump himself said Mitt Romney was wrong in calling for forced deportation and saying that, your kid, he pushed away the Latino voters, the Asian voters, everyone who's inspired to come into the country. Those were Donald Trump's words, right? So he himself, I think, was quite, to some extent, and Maggie Haberman talks about this in her book, that the sort of idea of building a wall was not necessarily the original core, right, of his sort of philosophy, right, as he kind of embarked upon running for president, at least in the pre-campaign period. And then he figured out that's really where the passion and the energy was in the Republican base. So obviously, it goes without saying, Trump takes the autopsy, does the opposite.
Yeah.
And I would say that helped him, right? I'm not going to say that, okay, he made these massive gains, because paradoxically, it turns out that Latinos want immigration restriction and the types of rhetoric that Trump was saying. That's not really the takeaway from 2016, but there was a strong enough, let's say, undercurrent of, let's say, appeal that Donald Trump had to these communities that really mitigated the damage that he could have faced from taking, that strong of a stance. And it wasn't just build a wall; it was insult the Mexican judge. It was those types of things, rapists, all the whole line from his announcement speech. So I think that pointed to me like, hey, there's something resilient about this, that it not only effectively shifts, realigns, those upper Midwestern states, but it doesn't cost you, at least automatically cost you, with these voters, because perhaps because of the unique mix of who Trump was. But going into the 2016 election, I was never Trump. I said he would lose, go down to a devastating defeat, and that clearly didn't happen just based on the top line numbers. Let's just set aside the coalitional figures. And I think that for more people in the country, Donald Trump was maybe a better specimen, a better type of Republican than a Mitt Romney or John McCain, which is kind of not what I would have expected, right, based on my positioning and my assumptions. So, I went about, in writing this book, it was really a process of setting aside those biases, trying to set aside as best as I could where I came from, my political heritage, and looking at this as objectively as I possibly could, because I shared the goal, right? I mean, I shared the goal of, understanding that the country is becoming a minority country by 2045. That in theory, that this actually, like the autopsy writers were right in terms of we have to solve this problem. It's just the actual programmatic solution was not necessarily what they envisioned, and it turned out to be a lot more complicated than what they envisioned.
And I guess to pick up kind of the story here, once again, to the point about this not just purely being a Trump book, the trends continue after 2020, which is what makes this like a viable book from my kind of academic intellectual perspective. Yeah. So take us to January 21st, Biden's in office. Where does the story go from there when it comes to this trend of working class populist minority support in the Republican Party?
Yeah, I mean, so I had written it and possibly with the expectation that, I could be proven wrong in 2024. I still might be proven wrong in 2024. Judish and Teixeira were proven, the first election after their book came out, right, was 2004. And, it turned out to maybe there wasn't an emerging Democratic majority. So the first thing I wanted to do is just make clear, this is not emerging Republican majority 2.0. I still believe we have competitive two-party politics. The idea of any kind of permanent majority, especially the Democratic one rooted in demographics, is fool's gold. So I don't think we will see that. But the real first test of this was the November 2021 off-year election. So where you started to see the thing about Glenn Youngkin in Virginia obviously winning, and that being taken as evidence of there's going to be a huge red wave in 22, based on if you just shift the House by however many points Virginia shifted. There was an expectation, right? So sort of overall Republican strength. But I was really interested in where that Republican strength was. You had a candidate in Glenn Youngkin who was this very kind of old school Romney style Republican who nonetheless was able to expand on Trump's margins in the rural white working class southwestern part of the state, famously sort of adjacent to some of the coal heavy areas of West Virginia, Kentucky. He's able to expand that margin. So it's Trump plus. And then, what evidence we have is that he also does better among communities of color as well. So simultaneously, he's able to do that. I believe in the New Jersey governor's race, you had a very close election, and you look at the precinct data, Latinos, swung more. So you see this trend kind of continuing for down ballot Republicans, and you see it continuing to an extent into the midterms, which are not the red wave predicted by the 21 elections, but nonetheless, you see Lee Zeldin, making these gains in New York State, doubling the Republican share of the vote in New York City, especially among Asian voters, Latino voters, immigrant communities there. You see Ron DeSantis in Florida leverage his performance to start a presidential campaign. We'll see if it's still, maybe not, maybe not quite in the way he envisioned at first, but leverage his strong performance in Florida, but especially among Puerto Rican voters. And you see these trends kind of continuing into, 22, Republicans picking up some seats in the Rio Grande Valley, for instance. Now, typically speaking, there's sort of this belief that, the trends that we've seen before previously, when George W. Bush, for instance, George W. Bush also did really well with Hispanic voters. And it was he had a personal affinity and connection to them. So in some ways, Bush's gains were bigger than Trump's, right? But I think that was a momentary kind of flash in the pan, because you had kind of immigration kind of take center stage after that. And you saw Bush kind of was no longer, really a strong, viable national leader. But the fact that, normally you see this sort of personal surge of support for a particular candidate that then fades away. But what I saw after 2020 specifically was these trends just continue to take hold in down ballot elections in the midterms, and you're even seeing it in the pre-2024 polling, where just reduced margins for Biden among African Americans, Hispanics. Most of the polling is now showing the Hispanic vote within 10 points for 2024. That's not where things may end up, but it's certainly a warning sign that these trends are continuing.
When it comes to these expanded gains in these surprising communities, is this an age issue? So, for example, if you told me that it's just Hispanic boomers are voting much more like white boomers, that has different implications than no, these gains are actually happening even with millennials, Gen X, definitely probably not Gen Z, but how does the age breakdown matter here?
So David Shore, I'm sure you know, and your readers will know, or your viewers will know, listeners, sorry, got the medium right there. But David Shore has put this to me really succinctly that from his vantage point as a Democrat, that young voters are a positive force for us among white voters and a negative force for us among non-white voters, in the sense of that a lot of these voting trends among non-white voters, but especially African-American voters, were solidified either in the 1960s or are a holdover of, a period of very ethnically divided 20th century politics and immigrant politics, where, people come to, specific, Puerto Ricans settle in New York City, or people settle in different areas of the country and become very politically coalesced in big city machines. And so, typically voting in Democratic primaries to try to exert really the maximum influence in urban politics, and urban politics is primarily Democratic, right? So, what starts to happen, and what has sort of begun to unfold is people are moving out of the cities. You have a new generation of voters who is not necessarily is growing up in more racially mixed contexts. In general, I think not universally so necessarily, but in general, that generationally, you're seeing openings for Republicans among younger Latino, younger African American voters, specifically because they just don't adhere to these sort of old political traditions, right? That really drove the Democratic allegiance of these groups. So, I think to some extent, and this is also something that Ecky's research that has really deeply studied these shifts among the Latino community, and they come from a Democratic perspective also. And they have said, in their polling, the biggest shifts they saw, the biggest movement they saw was among low propensity voters. And that's predominantly young voters, right? So the biggest changes, positive shift in Trump's approval rating throughout 2020 was really among younger Latinos. And that was, I think one of their big takeaways from the shifts we saw in 2020.
That's an interesting issue, which is this goes to how these dynamics could shift our political lexicon. Is higher turnout and efforts designed to increase turnout a positive or a negative for Republicans? Then I didn't read the piece, but I saw a headline just pointing out that it's possible for like automatic voter registration in Pennsylvania, typically seen as something benefiting Democrats through higher turnout, could actually end up turning out those low propensity voters who could favor Trump. So how could we think of that dynamic there?
I think that's right. I mean, I think the first numbers coming out of Pennsylvania, and they're like, again, anytime you vote, you report on, let's say, momentary, like week to week changes in registration, right? That's you're really talking about pretty small numbers, particularly when you're in an odd year. But the first few weeks of automatic voter registration in Pennsylvania saw twice as many new Republican registrations as Democratic registrations. You're also just seeing, I think, general weakness right now for Joe Biden and the Democrats, and by extension, the Democrats among younger voters, and a function of perhaps responses to Biden's age, the idea that he's sort of not the right man, he's out of step with this generation in particular, but really driven by I think reactions to I think the combination, right? I don't think it's just his age, because Bernie had a lot of support, right, despite his age, but just the, let's say, lack of energy and vigor and kind of establishment style politics that they see from Biden. and so I think, like, that is combining to create this thing where, I think you would normally, according to all the conventional wisdom, the more voters you registered. Michelle Obama had this group in 2020 called When We All Vote, sort of expressing this hope that, when we all vote, Democrats are, going to have these eternal majorities, right? And it turns out to have been flipped. I think pretty convincingly. And I think it's flipped to a large degree because, Democrats are gathering strength among white college voters. White college voters, have the highest turnout rates by far of any group. So when you're talking about, yes, these off-year elections and these special elections that Democrats have been touting their performance in, it's not surprising to me that Democrats are now doing well in those special elections. As a Republican, I view that as a challenge, right? It's not surprising me when it is a much lower turnout profile election because you have college-educated voters who just turn out at higher rates than. So really, who's left? And what you really have left in the electorate, which is this kind of populist majority I talk about, which is you either have groups with lower registration and voting are white non-college voters. Younger non-white college voters are actually more Republican than older non-white college voters. So within a lot of these groups, right, you're seeing the age flip. And you have those that are overwhelmingly Republican, maybe a non-white vote that has an eroding Democratic advantage. And it's no longer this clear-cut difference, let's say. And I think we're especially seeing that early on in 2024.
I'd like to ask you to kind of, and this is separate than your polling work, but for the purpose of this conversation, I'd like you to put on a blue hat instead of a red hat to help us kind of, and not a Trumpy red hat, really just generic 2012 Republican red hat, to help me kind of understand something, because I would love to hear what you think Democrats should do in response to this trend. Because the frustration I had speaking with Roy and John was that on the one hand, I can like smirk at the lameness of like Latinx and agree that Ruben Gallego, for example, the likely Democratic nominee in Arizona, is saying, hey, Democrats, stop saying Latinx. It isn't how Hispanic people speak. I agree with that. I think that's largely true. But the skeptical side of me is like, okay, but like real talk, how many actual like Latino voters are sitting around making their voting ballots? They're like, God dang it. If only the Dems hadn't, said LGBTQIA plus or Latinx, I would have stayed. Cause I just don't think that's quite, there's something superficial about the anti-woke critique within the Democratic Party's efforts that I think is just not really gotten to the actual issue. So I'd love to hear your kind of reflection on that dynamic.
I think these things change. I mean, I'm pretty sanguine around, how easy or hard. I mean, I am pretty, I do think a lot of these trends are hard to shift and a lot to change because these are trends that are happening throughout the West. So, if I look at, what's happening in the UK, Australia, places like that, I mean, the conservatives, are losing Battersea and maybe Kensington and Chelsea, right? They're losing. You have the Australian Liberals are no longer winning. The coastal areas in Sydney. I mean, so, at least the challenge from the Republican Party perspective and the conservative center-right perspective throughout the world is they're universally losing in their former bastions, their former, most of the world blue, but in the United States, red bastions. And Democrat, and they're seeing compensating gains from the Democratic side elsewhere. Now, I go back to something like Brian Kemp in Georgia, right, who dramatically outperformed Donald Trump's numbers in places like Buckhead, north of Atlanta, in these very wealthy suburbs. Yet he was only able to recapture about a third of the vote that Mitt Romney had, in terms of he was only able to reverse about a third of the losses that Donald Trump made. And this is as somebody who is the most politically successful anti-Trump Republican in the country, and the person who stood out most effectively to Donald Trump and came through it and was rewarded for it, right? So that tells me that these trends are durable and that, if anything, yes, you can partially reverse them. Joe Biden was elected because he partially reversed, right, the trends among white non-college voters, just by a couple points. But it was just enough in those three key Midwestern battlegrounds, right? So I don't think we're looking for either party, right, should be looking for a dramatic overnight miracle. What I would just say is that, there are benefits, and this is a message to both parties. There are benefits to moderation on both sides, and I don't think, yes, I think you're right to zero in on the critique of Latinx and things like that, because I think that's a minor manifestation of a larger issue. The larger issue is that there's this just huge mismatch between where non-white voters stand ideologically and how they vote. And the theory is that if Republicans can close that gap, that if non-white voters, Black voters especially, begin to vote more on just ideological lines, that doesn't make them a Republican group, but it does make them a 75-25 group, which if that happens, that's 3 to 4 points of the national popular vote margin, right? That's a 3 or 4 point margin shift. So that would be remarkable, right? If that happened. Now that in and of itself won't happen overnight, but I think this is the main really underlying and driving force is that politics in general is becoming more ideologically sorted, especially and including among non-white voters, and that's what's really driving these trends, and that's why you can't pinpoint one specific issue, right? But I would say that part and parcel of when you look at the strategy that Bill Clinton was able to, that's often harkened back to the triangulation strategy of Bill Clinton in the 1990s. I think it was dramatically different than what we're seeing today from Joe Biden, that Joe Biden's kind of trying to talk, sprinkle in references to infrastructure and to, semiconductor manufacturing. I think what Bill Clinton was doing was fundamentally different in terms of actively trying to poke the cultural left in the eye a lot of times, whether it was signing the Defense of Marriage Act, whether it was, his school uniforms and all these micro initiatives that he had. So he was really consciously trying to send the message that, he, pretty much root and branch, for the most part, rejected, I think, the extreme cultural left, which I don't think that any Democrat today would dare to.
Well, and the key thing there is it's not just, and this is why the Latinx thing misses something, which is a Democrat doing a Sister Soldier moment with Latinx. That would poke the left in the eye, but that wouldn't actually take an issue from the right. That's like a defensive move. When school uniforms, the crime bill, big government as we know it is over, welfare, those were Bill Clinton taking issues from Republicans, kind of being a status quo person, but taking anti-status quo critiques and owning that. That's I don't see how Democrats are able to. It's unclear. I guess, actually, here's the example of this. I'm sure you've seen these in 3 states, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, and now Maryland. Democratic governors have signed legislation ending significant requirements for bachelor's degrees in state government. That is an example of Democrats trying to say, look, we see the diploma divide, we see the higher education divide. We're going to try to take some of that anti-status quo energy that Republicans have and do it to our own side. So I think that's a kind of a mini example of that. But once again, it's not as if most Americans in the middle or working classes dream of, I was going to work in the DMV, but that pesky BA requirement really stopped me from doing it. I'm sure that person actually quite literally exists, but we're not going to be able to build a sustainable politics off of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. The space for policy, let's say innovation, is definitely narrowed, right, in the current environment. And so I take that point. It's one I reference, right? But I do think that there is, to speak to that example, I do think that there is just benefit to doing these things that, that you're actually responding to the economic and social divides that exist, not the one you imagine exists. So if I'm looking at somebody who, lives in a rural community and has been left behind, or there's a sense of being left behind, the people in those communities aren't looking around and seeing there's the rich person with the house on the hill who took all this stuff away from me, right? They don't see that person anymore. That person has moved. They're moved to a big city. I mean, they don't exist at all in these communities. The demons in these communities are fentanyl, opioid addiction, deaths of despair, and all of these issues, right? And the real driving force behind it, I mean, it's the social disconnection more than the question of economic equality that really is, I think, either at the top of people's minds, or is really kind of the underlying thing that has gone wrong in these communities, is that people don't have positive role models or positive examples, or can go or feel like they can you go to college or escape these types of circumstances. And that is more of an education divide than it is an economic divide. So I think that the more we do, both as a Republican Party, but also as a Democrat, also Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, give him credit for passing this type of legislation, is say, let's address the actual social divides that actually exist, as opposed to the 20th century kind of old economic debate that no longer seems relevant to a lot of people.
So here's the closing thought. And this was just fun because your episodes are coming out on different days next week. But I interviewed John Judas and Roy Chisera, and then you, like, within a 2-hour period. So I can just kind of react, because I think you have different publishers. So no offense, Henry Holt versus HarperCollins. But I think people should buy your 2 books together, because they come at these issues from different perspectives. They're doing it the same theme. It seems to me the broad reaction to both of our conversations and these 2 books has just been, if you are a political party in the West broadly, your biggest fear should be getting associated with the status quo. Joe Biden had the advantage of being a status quo normal politician, but if it's 2020, that means you're very anti-status quo if the status quo is Donald Trump. And now the problem for him is that people have forgotten whatever they didn't like about Trump, and we're just kind of regressing to the norm. But how do you advise political parties moving forward into this decade? How do they just avoid this status quo trap? Because that just seems to me to be like the problem. If this is George W. Bush, this is your problem in 2008. If you're Mitt Romney, this is your problem in 2012. Like, Obama's able to kind of jujitsu him that way. How do political parties solve this status quo definitional problem?
I mean, I do think that that is, I think we're seeing, regardless of who the incumbent party is, that there is just been a general decline in the whole right track, wrong track question that we track religiously as pollsters, right? And there's sort of like this rule, right? When I was first coming up, oh well, the right track number can't, or the wrong track can't be above 45, or some ridiculous rule. So you have the direction of the country going in the right direction, is off on the wrong track. So the pollsters have used this exact same wording for decades, and now the right track number is sitting at 23, wrong track is high 60s. And despite it's all the economy's doing well. So this growing sense of pessimism, right, that is new, that is relatively new. Whereas, even in 2004, when I was working on the Bush campaign, I mean, we watched this number and we even wanted to make sure it wasn't underwater. So now Biden, the incumbent party, is 40 points underwater on this question. Let's set aside the point of his job approval being 15 to 20 points underwater. We have right track is underwater. So there's been, I think, a permanent reset, right, in the disadvantage in being positioned as a mainstream establishment politician that didn't exist. Certainly when Joe Biden first ran for president, maybe when he was second, then he ran for president for the second time in 2008 as well. And that's been a shift really in the last 15 to 20 years. I do, it's definitely behind, really. I mean, even the mainstream center-left parties, and even some mainstream center-left or center-right parties fading away throughout Europe. I think we're seeing that pretty consistently.
That is an excellent place to end. Patrick, thank you so much for joining me on the Realignment. This book is at the core of what got me interested in this space, in this podcast in the first place. I think this is a highly recommended read for everyone.
Thanks so much.